Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. Previously, I said that the .NET Framework class library is just a collection of classes that contain methods filled with functionality that you can use, but you didn't have to worry about, you didn't have to write them. Somebody at Microsoft has already created those for us. In fact, Microsoft has spent tens of thousands of man-hours writing code, and we get the benefit of it by all we have to do is just know that the code exists, call it by its name, and utilize it inside of our applications. That's pretty cool. So since the framework class library is so large, its developers split it up into multiple files. So if you had to load every single line of code in the framework class library, every time that you wanted to run a simple application, it would be excruciatingly slow and it would require a massive portion of your computer's memory. So these library code files are called assemblies, and all of the classes and methods are split up into different assemblies. In fact, when you create your own projects, you are creating the basis for a .NET assembly as well. In fact, there are two kinds of assemblies that we're talking about here. The first kind is an executable assembly, and the other kind is a library. All right, so just make sure that you understand that there's two different kinds of .NET assemblies. There is a executable assembly that has a .exe file extension. And then there is a library that only has code. There's nothing really executable about it. You can't just like start it by double clicking it. It just contains functionality, and those have a .dll file extension. Again, it's intended to be used by other code that is executable. All right. So every time that we run an application here inside of Visual Studio, what happens is that an executable .NET assembly is generated for us inside of the bin directory for our project. So if we were to take a look at, here, let me just pop open our projects folder, and we were just working with, which one were we working with here just a moment ago? I think we were working with Understanding Scope. So if we were to drill into the project folder, we'd see a bin directory. If you drill into the bin directory, there will be a debug directory. If you drill into there, you'll see a number of files, but the most important is the understanding scope.exe. If we were to double click it, then we would get the results from the previous video. All right, so there are some other files that are included here which help Visual Studio's debugging experience connect to the executing assembly, and so you can safely ignore these. They're just regenerated every time that you want to create a new version of or rerun your application in debug mode. But at any rate, the .NET Framework has to already be installed on the computer where you're going to actually execute this program in order for it to work, because it will load itself into the .NET Framework runtime, and like we talked about near the very beginning of this course, and it will live inside of that protective bubble. Now, fortunately, just about every copy of Windows already has the .NET Framework installed in a location that's globally accessible by all .NET applications, so you don't have to distribute the .NET Framework with your applications whenever you want to distribute it to other people. And so that location is called the Global Assembly Cache. Unfortunately, that's not something we have to worry about. It's just sitting on everybody's computer. So back to my original point, whenever you create your application, you indicate which of those framework class library assembly files that you intend to use. And you say, well, wait a second, I don't remember ever declaring that I wanted to create an executable versus a library, but actually you did whenever you were actually choosing to create a file new project. You were selecting a console application, and by default it'll create an executable for you. However, we could, and we will in the next lesson, create a class library, and that'll allow us to create a .dll file that only contains classes with methods inside of it that we can then use from other executable applications, whether it be a console application or a Windows or even a web application. All right, so let me just cancel that. So at any rate, let's go ahead and get started by creating a new application here called Resolving References. You can see that I've already taken the liberty of creating a new project called Resolving References. And what I want to do is talk about the references to the various classes that you'll need access to in order to get work done. The classes defined in the .NET Framework class library, how do we add a reference to those and utilize them? We've already seen this one time whenever we were trying to use the string builder class. You remember I tried to use dim my string builder as new string builder. And at that point, I got the red squiggly line, and it said string builder is, the type string builder is not defined. And I said, well, I know that it exists in the .NET framework, but what I needed to do was to actually get a reference to the namespace where that particular class lives. Now, sometimes you're going to need to add a reference to an assembly that's not currently referenced by your project. But as you're getting started, that will not happen very often. If we take a look at the Solution Explorer and you were to expand references, you can see that there are all of these references to these DLL files. Even though they don't have the DLL file extension, they are actually all saved in different DLL files. And you can see here in the properties window near the bottom right hand corner that in this particular case the system.xml.link is actually saved in a file called system.xml.link.dll, and same is with system data. It's saved in a file called system.data.dll. All right, and so there's a whole bunch of files here. System.dll, these are all references that were added for us by default whenever we created a new console window application, because these are common namespaces and assemblies that contain stuff that we will typically need as software developers. So that's one of the functions of the project templates as we create new projects. So typically you're not going to need, especially as you're getting started, you're not going to need to add any additional references because you're not going to use a custom DLL, although we'll do that in the very next lesson. Most of the functionality will be in one of these namespaces, in one of these assemblies, all right? Or maybe you need to add a reference to an assembly that's created by a third party. Maybe not you, maybe not Microsoft, maybe some other company. And again, in the next lesson, I'll demonstrate how we'll create a reference to an assembly that's not already referenced inside of our project. But once a DLL is referenced in our project, we might need to then find it by its name. Now, again, I said a little bit ago that the .NET Framework class library is massive. There are tens of thousands of classes defined in the full .NET Framework class library across all of the assemblies. And so in a few cases, there were the same class name needed to be used. And so when that happened, the creators needed a way to tell each of those classes apart. So they introduced the concept of a namespace. So namespaces, like I said earlier, are like last names for your classes. So for example, my first name is Bob, and you might try to say, hey, Bob likes coffee. And somebody else might say, which Bob are you talking about? I know like a dozen Bobs, and there's like a billion Bobs in the world, okay? And they say, oh, no. You know, Robert Theron Tabor. All right, well, they may not use that formal language, but if you were to disambiguate me by my full name, my middle and my last name, you could probably uniquely identify me to the world. I'm pretty sure I'm the only Robert Theron Tabor. That middle name is pretty unique. I know there's a lot of Bob Tabors out there. But at any rate, this disambiguates me from every other Bob or every other Bob Tabor out there by using my full name. So namespaces in the .NET Framework class library disambiguate class names. So now you could use the full name, or you can just add an import statement. In this case, you can see that I have the name string builder, but my program doesn't know where to find the string builder class. Now you can see there's this little quick actions light bulb that appears off to the left hand side, or if I hover my mouse cursor over it, I can then select to either import system.txt. We did that last time. Remember how it added that to this import statement then at the very top of my file. But let me comment that out. That should give us an error message again. And this time, let me just use the full namespace. And you're like, well, that's not really the full namespace. That's right. The full namespace is system.text.stringbuilder. All right. But since system is assumed to be part of your the namespaces that are imported by default, you don't need to add it. You could just go text. But honestly, if you're going to go to that extent, I would recommend that you go ahead and use the full name to remove any unclarity. So those are two ways in which you can find the classes in the .NET Framework class library that you already have references to, that you're already referencing the assemblies that live in the global assembly cache on the user's computer. All right. So, by the way, a couple of things that you probably need to know about. Number one, your project will automatically have a namespace, and it'll be the name of the project. If you want to change the default namespace for your project, what you'll need to do is select the project inside of the Solution Explorer. You can right-click and then select Properties. And you can see if we go down to, the assembly name will be Resolving References, and the root namespace will be Resolving References. Now we could change the root namespace, but we should probably leave it by default. So whenever we're calling into, for example, if we had some classes, it will automatically know that those classes are in the same namespace as module 1. If not, we could import that new namespace, or we could add the full name of the class. So resolving references.car, for example. Why is this important? Well, typically, whenever you want to build applications, you're going to want to do something and you're not going to know how to do it. So at that point, you're probably going to open up a web browser and you're going to start doing some searches out on the internet. So for example, say I wanted to figure out how to write text from my application to a file, to a text file on my computer. So what I might do is do a search in Bing. So search, and I'm going to just refine this search and say I only want to search Microsoft.com. Write to a text file and then Visual Basic. All right, and this will probably get me to a good article on how to write text to files in Visual Basic. Happens to be the top answer there. And so now what I might want to do, and they give me a couple of different examples here. All right, now it looks to me like this particular article is cheating a little bit. It's using the my namespace, and that's not really going to accomplish what I want for this video. We're going to talk about the my namespace in the very next video and how the my namespace makes some things extremely simple. We can find most of these types of functions just by using the my namespace. It's special to Visual Basic. But this isn't a good test of the functionality because, frankly, we're cheating a little bit here. Let's go back, and instead let's search for something different. We're still going to search Microsoft.com, but this time let's go Visual Basic retrieve HTML string, and let's see how to retrieve data from a website using Visual Basic. All right, so. Not sure this is exactly what I'm looking for either, but I happen to know if I were to do the searches for something called the web client, I'd be able to find some examples in Visual Basic. There we go. Let's see this example on MSDN. And here I'm going to go to the VB version of this and see if it gives me any good examples down here near to the bottom on MSDN. Yeah, and so here we have the VB version of our code, and I can kind of look through and see how this will actually work. And this seems to be like a pretty advanced example. What if I look for this download string? I happen to know that that's the method I'm looking for. And again, we're looking at the VB version here. And so, yeah, this is a little bit more like it. This is what I want. So here they give us the ability to to put in an address and then grab the content from that address. So I'm just going to copy these 3 lines of code, Control C, and then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to paste these in. Now, yes, here's what I wanted to demonstrate to you. When you paste in code from the internet, sometimes you're not going to have the references. You're going to need to resolve the references. Now, you'll see that this little light bulb will pop up sometimes, and it will give you the import statement, or it'll automatically type out for you the entire namespace for the given class if it recognizes it. However, what I'd recommend, so you can keep your fingers on the keyboard at all times, is to hit the control period, and this will open up that little dialog and allow you to use the up and down arrows to choose which of these you want. In this case, I want to import system.net. That's the namespace where the web client class is from. And then in this case, all we need to do is pass in, I think, just an address as a string. So I'm going to type in my website, devview.com, and then it should be able to give us back all of the HTML from my website and print it off to the console window. So let's see if that worked. There we go. All right. It took a second, but we got it. And now we've got all of the HTML. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And so you can see that we were able to copy code off the internet. We had to resolve the references by hitting control period on the keyboard in order to bring up that little menu and eventually add a import statement for the namespace for the class that we want to use, and then we can continue on. All right, so that's all I really wanted to illustrate, is how to work with namespaces and how to resolve references to classes that are referenced or that we have references to because they're part of assemblies that are referenced in our project, but that we have not yet imported the namespace into our project's consciousness. All right, so we're going to continue on and take a look at the my namespace in the next video, and we'll continue on from there. And we'll see how we can utilize the my namespace to do some pretty cool stuff without having to hunt and find all of the classes that we might typically need in order to do interesting things with our applications. So we'll see you there. Thanks.